Hey everyone, welcome back. You know we love a good deep dive here, and today's topic is no exception. We're going to dig into the world of cognitive biases. You know, those sneaky little mental shortcuts our brains take that can sometimes lead us to make some not so great decisions, let's be honest.
And not just random mistakes either. We're talking about these like predictable patterns hardwired into how we think.
Okay, that sounds a little unsettling when you put it like that. It's like our own brains are working against us.
Oh, and in a way, yeah. But the good news is,
Mm-hmm.
once we know about these biases, we can start to watch out for them.
So we're not totally at the mercy of our own flawed thinking.
Exactly.
So to help us unpack all of this, we're turning to The Art of Thinking Clearly by Rolf Dobelli. He's a former novelist, by the way, who got kind of obsessed with psychology and decided to write a whole book about these fascinating quirks of human thinking.
And it's a really great read. Dobelli does a fantastic job of explaining these complex concepts in a clear and engaging way. Plus, he uses a ton of relatable examples, which I always appreciate.
Me too, because let's be real, sometimes psychology can feel a little, textbooky. But Dobelli keeps things interesting. So before we get too deep into specific examples, can you give us a quick definition of cognitive biases?
Sure. Basically, they're like these mental shortcuts, these rules of thumb that our brains use to process information quickly. And most of the time, they work pretty well. They help us make sense of a complex world and make decisions without getting bogged down in too much analysis.
Makes sense. Our brains are busy places.
Right. But the problem is, sometimes these shortcuts, these biases, they lead us astray. They cause us to make systematic errors in our thinking, which can have a big impact on our lives.
Okay, so not just random brain farts then.
Not at all. These are like predictable patterns that we all fall prey to, whether we realize it or not.
And why should we care about these biases? What's the big deal if our brains take a few shortcuts here and there?
Well, because these biases can affect our decisions,
Mhm.
our judgments, even our perceptions of the world. They can lead us to make bad investments, misjudge people,
Huh.
and even make decisions that are harmful to ourselves or others.
Mm.
And the scariest part is, we're often completely unaware that these biases are even influencing us.
So we're not just talking about like minor slip-ups here. These biases can have real consequences.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to be aware of them.
So knowledge is power when it comes to these mental traps.
Exactly. Once we know about these biases,
Yeah.
we can start to recognize them in our own thinking
Hmm.
and hopefully make more rational and informed decisions.
All right, so let's start unpacking some of these biases. What's a good example of one that might be tripping us up without us even realizing it?
Well, let's talk about survivorship bias. Have you ever heard someone say, all the really successful people dropped out of college?
Oh, yeah,
It's
definitely.
like a common trope, right?
Yeah.
We hear about Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg.
Mhm.
Now they think, maybe I should ditch school and start a tech company too. But what we're forgetting about are all the people who dropped out of college and didn't become billionaires. In fact, most of them probably didn't.
Oh, right. It's like we're only seeing the winners, the survivors, and forgetting about all the people who tried the same thing and didn't make it.
Precisely. And that's survivorship bias in a nutshell.
Uh,
We tend to focus on the people who've succeeded
mhm.
and ignore all the people who've failed, even if the failures outnumber the successes by a huge margin.
And why does our brain do this?
Well, our brains are wired to pay attention to patterns and to try to make sense of the world around us. So when we see a bunch of successful college dropouts, our brains jump to the conclusion that dropping out of college is the key to success. It's easier for our brains to focus on that pattern than to consider all the other factors that might be at play.
So it's like our brains are trying to simplify things, but that simplification can sometimes lead us to the wrong conclusion.
Exactly.
And what's the harm in believing that dropping out of college is the path to success?
Well, for one thing, it might lead some people to make decisions that aren't in their best interest. Not everyone is cut out to be an entrepreneur, and a college degree can be incredibly valuable in today's job market.
That's a really good point. So how do we avoid falling prey to survivorship bias?
Well, the key is to be aware of it. The next time you hear a success story, ask yourself, what are all the other possible outcomes? What are all the people who tried the same thing and failed? Once you start looking for it, you will be amazed at how often survivorship bias pops up.
I bet. This is already making me rethink a lot of my assumptions.
That's great. That's the first step to thinking more clearly.
So survivorship bias is one sneaky little mental trap. What other cognitive biases should we be on the lookout for?
Well, let's talk about confirmation bias. This one is a real doozy.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, and even recall information in a way that confirms our existing beliefs.
So basically, we're more likely to believe information that supports what we already think.
Exactly. And we're more likely to ignore or discount information that contradicts our beliefs.
Oh, wow. I can see how that would be a problem.
It can be a huge problem. It can prevent us from seeing the world clearly and from making objective decisions.
Okay, can you give me an example of how confirmation bias might play out in real life?
Sure. Let's say you're really passionate about a particular political candidate.
Okay, I'm following.
You're more likely to seek out news sources that support that candidate and to avoid news sources that are critical of that candidate. You're also more likely to remember information that paints the candidate in a positive light and to forget information that reflects negatively on them.
Oh, wow. I can definitely see how that could happen.
And it's not just about politics, of course. Confirmation bias can affect our beliefs about anything: religion, science, even our own personal relationships.
So how do we fight against confirmation bias? Because it sounds like it's something we all do, even if we don't realize it.
It is something we all do, but we can fight against it. The first step is simply being aware of it. Once we know that we have this tendency to seek out information that confirms our beliefs, we can start to be more critical of the information we consume. We can try to seek out information from a variety of sources, even sources that we might not agree with. And we can try to be more open-minded, to consider the possibility that we might be wrong.
That's easier said than done, though, right? It's hard to admit when we're wrong.
It is hard, but it's so important. If we're not willing to be wrong, then we're not really open to learning and growing.
That's a really good point. So being aware of our biases is the first step to overcoming them.
Exactly.
And being open to being wrong is key to learning and growing.
Precisely.
Wow, this is already giving me a lot to think about.
Good. That's what we're here for.
You know, it's funny how sometimes we can let a single news story or something really vivid totally skew our perception of risk.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, I'm talking about, has this ever happened to you? Where you maybe see a news report about a plane crash and then suddenly you're terrified to fly.
Oh, yeah.
Even though, rationally, you know, it's statistically much safer than driving.
It's a classic example of what Dobelli calls the availability bias, where things that are easier to recall or that are more vivid in our minds seem more likely to happen, even if they're not.
It's like our brains just latch onto that scary image or that dramatic story,
Maybe.
and we forget about all the times we flew without a hitch or whatever the statistically safer option is.
Exactly.
It's like, I remember one time I was like convinced I was going to get in a car accident just because I'd seen like one too many fender benders on my commute that week.
It's funny how our brains work that way, right? But it makes sense because from an evolutionary standpoint, it was probably advantageous to be able to quickly recall and react to potential dangers.
Right, like back in the day when we had to worry about saber-toothed tigers and whatnot.
Exactly. But in our modern world, where we're bombarded with information, this bias can really trip us up.
So how do we combat this availability bias? How do we stop ourselves from making decisions based on fear rather than facts?
Well, I think a big part of it is just being aware of the bias in the first place.
Yeah.
Once you know that your brain tends to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easy to recall, you can start to question those assumptions.
That makes sense.
Like the next time you see a scary news story, take a moment to think about how often that event actually occurs and compare it to the likelihood of other, maybe less memorable, but more common risks.
So basically, don't let the news, or social media for that matter, totally hijack our sense of what's actually dangerous or risky.
Exactly.
Okay, that's super helpful, actually. Now, I've got to ask you about this next bias Dobelli talks about, because it really hit home for me. It's called the endowment effect.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever experienced this one, where you become like weirdly attached to something you own? And you value it way more than you probably should just because it's yours?
Oh, absolutely. I think we've all been there.
Dobelli gives this great example in the book about how he bought this BMW, I think it was, for $40,000.
Yeah, I remember that.
And then, like, the very next day, someone offered him $53,000 for it. Talk about a quick profit.
Right.
But he's, like, agonizing over whether to sell it.
Because he's already attached to it. It's his car now.
Exactly. And I totally get it. Like, I have this whole bin of clothes in my closet that I haven't worn in years, but I just can't seem to get rid of them.
It's like we imbue these objects with some kind of special meaning just because they belong to us.
It's so irrational.
It is. But it's also just part of being human, I think.
So how do we break free from the clutches of the endowment effect?
Well, like with the other biases we've talked about, awareness is key. Just knowing that this bias exists can help us to be more objective than we're making decisions about our possessions.
So, like, when I'm staring at that bin of clothes, I should try to think about whether I'd actually pay money for those clothes today.
Exactly. Would you buy that shirt again if you saw it in the store?
Probably not.
And if the answer is no, then it might be time to let it go.
Okay, I'm going to try to keep that in mind next time I'm doing a closet clean out.
I think it's a good rule of thumb for all of us.
So far, we've been talking about how these biases affect us as individuals, but I'm curious to know how they play out in larger contexts, like in groups or even on a societal level.
Yeah, that's a great point. Because these biases don't just exist in a vacuum. They can definitely influence how we interact with others and how groups function as a whole.
So, like, what's an example of a bias that rears its head in group settings?
Well, one that comes to mind is social loafing. Have you ever noticed how sometimes when you're working in a group,
Mhm.
people tend to put in less effort than they would if they were working individually?
Oh, for sure. It's like that classic group project scenario where you have that one person who's carrying the whole team.
Exactly. And there are a few reasons why this happens. One is that when we're in a group, our individual contributions feel less noticeable. So we might be less motivated to go above and beyond.
It's like our efforts kind of get lost in the crowd.
Right, exactly. And another factor is diffusion of responsibility. When there are other people around to share the workload,
Mm.
we might feel less personally accountable for the group's success or failure.
So it's like if the group fails, it's not entirely my fault because other people were supposed to be contributing too.
Yeah, there's definitely some of that going on.
So how do we prevent social loafing? Because I feel like it's something that happens in all sorts of group settings,
Mm.
from school projects to work teams.
It definitely is. And it can be a tough one to combat. But one thing that can help is to make individual contributions more visible.
Okay, how do we do that?
So for example, instead of just having everyone work on a project together, you could assign specific roles or tasks to each person.
Got
That
it.
way it's clear who's responsible for what, and people are more likely to be held accountable for their contributions.
Makes sense. So basically anything we can do to make individual efforts stand out more.
Exactly. And it's also important to foster a sense of team spirit and shared goals
Hmm.
so that people are motivated to work together and support each other.
Because ultimately, we want everyone to feel like they're a valuable part of the team
Exactly.
and that their contributions matter.
Precisely.
Okay, social loafing, check. What other groupthink traps should we be on the lookout for?
Well, this next one isn't so much about group dynamics specifically, but it does relate to how we perceive and understand large-scale trends and patterns. Dobelli talks about how our brains really struggle to grasp the concept of exponential growth.
Oh, right, I remember this part. He uses that example of folding a piece of paper in half over and over again, right?
Exactly. He asks, if you fold a piece of paper in half 50 times, how thick do you think it would be?
And most people vastly underestimate the answer.
They totally do. Because intuitively, we tend to think in linear terms.
So we assume that if you fold a piece of paper in half 50 times, it'll be like 50 times thicker.
Right, something like that. But in reality, with each fold, the thickness doubles.
Oh.
So after 50 folds, that piece of paper would actually reach, like, astronomical proportions.
Kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. And it just goes to show how our linear thinking can really limit our understanding of certain concepts.
And why is it so important that we wrap our heads around exponential growth?
Well, for one thing, it's becoming increasingly relevant in today's world. Think about things like population growth, the spread of information online, or even the advancement of technology.
Right. These things aren't just growing at a steady pace, they're accelerating all the time.
Exactly. And if we're not able to think exponentially, we're going to have a hard time keeping up with these rapid changes and making informed decisions about the future.
So, like, how do we get better at thinking exponentially?
Well, one way is to simply expose ourselves to more examples of it. Read about things like compound interest, Moore's law, or the growth of the internet.
So basically, just immerse ourselves in these concepts until they start to feel less foreign.
Exactly. And another helpful tip is to try to visualize the growth. Like with the paper folding example,
Mhm.
actually try folding a piece of paper a few times and see how quickly the thickness increases.
That's a good idea.
It'll help to solidify the concept in your mind.
It's all about finding ways to make these abstract ideas more concrete and relatable.
Exactly.
Speaking of things that can really distort our perception, there's one more bias Dobelli talks about that I wanted to touch on. The fundamental attribution error. It's the thing we do where we explain someone's behavior based on, like, their personality or their character instead of considering all the situational factors that might be at play.
Oh, it's so true. It's like we see someone acting a certain way,
Yeah.
and we immediately jump to the conclusion that that's just who they are,
Yeah.
without stopping to think about what might be going on in their life or what external factors might be influencing their behavior.
Yeah, like we automatically assume the worst of people sometimes.
Right.
It's like classic example, someone cuts you off in traffic. Your immediate reaction is like, what a jerk. But you have no idea what's going on with them. Maybe they just got terrible news or they're rushing to the hospital or who knows.
Exactly. They could be having the worst day of their life
You're over here like totally judging them.
and making up stories about them in our heads. Oh, they're just a jerk. They have no regard for anyone else.
Right, exactly.
But the reality is, we just don't know.
So it's a good reminder to have a little more empathy and give people the benefit of the doubt.
Absolutely. Because, we've all been in situations where we probably haven't been our best selves.
Oh, for sure.
We've all had those moments where we've snapped at someone or made a mistake or just been generally unpleasant. And in those moments, I think we all hope that the people around us will cut us some slack.
Right. Instead of assuming the worst.
Exactly.
So how do we train ourselves to be more mindful of this bias in our everyday lives?
Well, I think it starts with just being aware of it, as with many of these biases.
Okay.
And then when you find yourself making a judgment about someone's behavior, just take a moment to pause and ask yourself, what are some other possible explanations for why this person might be acting this way?
Okay, so like actively challenging our own assumptions.
Exactly. Because the more we can practice that kind of mental flexibility, the less likely we are to fall prey to the fundamental attribution error.
This is great. I am definitely going to be more aware of this. I can already tell.
Me too.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive on cognitive biases, but if there's one big takeaway you want our listeners to remember, what would it be?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is that these biases are everywhere. They're a normal part of being human.
Right.
But just because they're normal doesn't mean we have to let them control us. The more we know about these biases, the better equipped we'll be to recognize them in ourselves and in others,
Okay.
and hopefully make more rational, more informed decisions, not only in our own lives, but also in the ways that we interact with the world around us.
It's all about being a little more mindful, a little more self-aware.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I always enjoy talking about this stuff.
And for our listeners, if you're interested in learning more about cognitive biases and how they influence our thinking, be sure to check out Rolf Dobelli's book, The Art of Thinking Clearly. It's a great read, and it's packed with even more examples and strategies for overcoming these common mental pitfalls. Until next time, thanks for listening, and keep those minds sharp.